Who else is ordering this? Matt, you are.
All right, my turn. This lecture is about existential risk and how to debate existential risk, and it is very important. And I've been wanting to do this for a while, but I'm going to do it tonight, and so it would behoove you to pay attention. Originally, there were two parts of this lecture. The first part was about risk assessment. I'm going to do that at a different time. That's going to talk about how to debate risk assessment, how to compare different metrics for assessing risk. So reason, sort of elements of magnitude, elements of probability, elements of time frame, and why they matter. So if I've already told you or promised you that that's what we were going to talk about tonight, that is being outsourced to a future time or delayed until a future time. We're only going to do the second part of the lecture, which is an introduction or an explanation of how to debate existential risk. So there are three Roman numerals in this lecture. The first Roman numeral is an introduction to existential risk. The second Roman numeral is going for existential risk impacts, tips for going for existential risk impacts. And the third Roman numeral is tips for answering existential risk impacts. So introduction to existential risk, going for existential risk, answering existential risk. Roman numeral 1, an introduction to existential risk. Subpoint A is the definition of existential risk. Existential risk is something that has gotten thrown around in debate more and more recently. A lot of people have now begun to frame impacts which didn't used to be framed as extinction impacts as extinction impacts. But in the context of the literature about existential risk has a very particular meaning and definition, and it's important to know that. So Nick Bostrom, who's kind of the king or the number one author about existential risk in the contemporary academia, defines existential risk as follows. An existential risk is one that threatens the premature extinction of Earth-originating intelligent life or the permanent and drastic destruction of its potential for desirable future development. An existential risk is one that threatens the premature extinction of Earth-originating intelligent life or the permanent and drastic destruction of its potential for desirable future development. Bostrom says that the materialization of such a risk would be an existential catastrophe. So when you're reading about risk assessment or when you're reading about existential risk, the term existential risk has a very specific meaning. It is a term of art within the academic literature about risk. It is important to note that some people use the term existential risk in other contexts not to speak to that existential risk that Bostrom is defining, but instead to describe something as an existential risk to a nation, to an individual, to a community, to a value system, something like that. So when you come across hyperbolic language in journalism or in contexts where it doesn't really seem to be what Bostrom is talking about, it is probably not. So people might describe terrorism as an existential threat to America. That does not mean that terrorism threatens the premature extinction of Earth-originating intelligent life or the permanent and drastic destruction of its potential for desirable future development. It means that it threatens the America, right? The survival of America, which is different than the survival of Earth-originating intelligent life. Okay, I can't emphasize that enough. Oftentimes in debates about existential risk, the other team will have evidence that speaks to an existential risk, but it will be hyperbolic and not about the existential risk that Bostrom or other authors are talking about. Subpoint B, types of existential risks. So Bostrom divides existential risks into 4 categories, and we'll go through each of them and list some of the things that Bostrom says are probably existential risks. There are 4 categories. The first category is bangs. These are the most obvious ones. Something goes boom. Happens in an instant. The second category are crunches. These have to do with like resource issues, shortages, lack of supply. Third are shrieks. These kind of come out of nowhere and kill everyone. The fourth are whimpers. Whimpers are where we just kind of die out. It's not one thing. So the first category, bangs. Bostrom says these are the most obvious and goes into depth. He describes them in order. So I'm going to list what Bostrom describes as bangs that could cause extinction, and this is in the order that he lists them. First is deliberate misuse of nanotechnology. One thing that we'll talk about later is that when you're debating existential risk, it's important to debate which is comparatively more important to address. In Bostrom's view, the deliberate misuse of nanotechnology is the #1 threat to human extinction. Number 2 is nuclear holocaust. Self-evident. Number 3, and this is kind of a weird quirk of Bostrom, is we're living in a simulation and it gets shut down.
Yeah.
Okay?
Is he crazy?
We'll talk, Bostrom is one of the smartest people in the world. We'll talk about that scenario. That's not something that's likely to be debated about, but that is one bang that could happen that Bostrom describes. Next is badly programmed superintelligence. So if you've ever had a debate about singularity or about artificial intelligence, Bostrom's fear is that we will achieve those types of artificial intelligences, but we'll program them in a way that unexpectedly tells them to kill everyone. Like the Terminator.
Wasn't that a broadband advantage?
It was a broadband advantage, yes. Next is genetically engineered biological agents. So his fear is that researchers or scientists or governments, militaries will engineer a biological agent, like a genetic weapon, and it will inadvertently spread to everyone. Next, and this is very important, is something unforeseen. So this is the middle of his list of bangs that could cause extinction, something unforeseen. And here's how he explains that. We need a catch-all category. It would be foolish to be confident that we have already imagined and anticipated all significant risks. Future technological or scientific developments may very well reveal novel ways of destroying the world. The reason that's important will be discussed later, but this is going to be repeated in each of the next 3 sections. Next is physics disasters. This is something that sometimes does get debated in high school debates, often in the context of wipeout arguments or spark arguments. There are nuclear physics experiments occurring, and some people think that those experiments could go terribly wrong and end life. Could create a black hole, something like that. Next is naturally occurring diseases. These are pretty low on the list. This is getting to the bottom. Next is an asteroid or comet impact, which we obviously know lots about. We've been debating about it a lot. Bostrom puts that toward the bottom of bangs that could cause extinction. The last one on his list is runaway global warming. So he identifies this as a possible existential threat, but it is the bottom one on his list of existential threats. Now, does that mean that he doesn't think it's possible? No. Here are the things that he thinks are very unlikely to be existential risks. They did not make the list. Solar flares, supernova, black hole explosions or mergers, gamma ray bursts, galactic center outbursts, supervolcanoes, loss of biodiversity, buildup of air pollution, gradual loss of human fertility, religious doomsday scenarios, or collective suicide. Okay? He acknowledges that that is in fact an existential risk. He cites the voluntary human extinction movement, but he says very unlikely. Okay? So those are things that Bostrom thinks are not likely to cause extinction. Many of those are things that are debated in debates. I've heard almost all of those things as impacts. I don't know what a galactic center outburst is, but I might have even heard that in a debate. But certainly biodiversity, air pollution, supervolcanoes,
Suicide.
solar flares, collective suicide is a K impact, right? Bostrom says your K impact does not cause extinction. Okay, that is his list of bangs. Second area are crunches, which as I said are resource issues, shortages. He thinks it's less likely that one of these things will happen than that a bang happens that ends human life. But first on his list, and again, these are ranked in order, is resource depletion or ecological destruction. So we just run out of stuff, we destroy the environment, that could cause extinction, and it's the most likely crunch in his estimation to cause extinction. Second is misguided world government or another static social equilibrium that stops technological progress. So in his estimation, kind of DDEV might cause extinction. Next is dysgenic pressures, which is natural forces or genetic engineering that kind of pollutes the gene pool and causes lots of defective traits. So over time, the human gene pool just kind of gets messed up and we die out because our gene pool is just so bad. Next is technological arrest, which by that he means it just gets too hard for us to keep developing, and so we just stop. We just can't do it anymore. It's too hard. And finally, something unforeseen is the last one on the list. And as I explained before, he makes particular emphasis, and I think it is important, and we'll talk about why later. Something unforeseen is the last thing on the list. Number 3 is shrieks. He thinks these are more likely, at least than crunches, maybe than bangs. And the first one is another kind of weird quirk of his. He's very preoccupied with the idea that we are in a simulation. It's takeover by a transcending upload, which essentially means that our program will be replaced by a better one. Right? In the same way that Jonathan Paul is trying to download Lion to overwrite his current OS X operating system, Bostrom's fear is that that could happen to us, and we would just be gone.
It's done.
It's done.
I'm using Lion.
Excellent.
Ooh, how is it? What is the air share?
Second is flawed superintelligence.
I'll look at that.
So this is superintelligence that is not designed in a way that causes it to go awry. It's just we mess something up, and the process of messing it up kills us all.
What does Bostrom define a shriek as?
Yeah.
Something that it doesn't just come out of nowhere, but it is like an unexpected blip that we sort of thought that the path that we were on was okay, whereas a bang is just like we don't know. It could just happen at any time. A shriek is like we think we're good, and we die. Shriek. Flawed superintelligence. Third is a repressive totalitarian global regime. So similar to the issue above with the crunch, kind of the reason that totalitarian global regime maybe causes extinction is because it stops tech progress. And finally, again, something unforeseen. Fourth, whimpers. He kind of, at first, I sort of read him as saying that this is the best we can hope for, and we kind of would want to die out in a whimper. But then he answers that and says, no, we actually don't have to die out. We don't have to whimper. But these are the ones that are very unlikely, and almost this is probably not going to happen in a debate, although one of these impacts is a debate impact. So first is our potential or even our core values are eroded by evolution. So this is a very long-term thing, like in the billions of years. Over time, Earth-originating intelligent life just kind of ceases to be Earth-originating intelligent life. We just kind of evolve beyond life as we currently understand it. Second is that we are killed by an extraterrestrial civilization. He thinks that's possible, but unlikely. So unlike Stephen Hawking or some of the other people that are kind of anti-ET people, I don't necessarily think Bostrom is anti-ET, although he does have an interesting argument about how he hopes that there is no ET, which I can talk about at a future time. But then finally, something unforeseen. So there are these 4 categories of possible existential threats, and Bostrom has kind of categorized them. It's an interesting way to think about existential risk. This is probably a pretty comprehensive list, because obviously some of this stuff is pretty weird. Subpoint C, existential risk compared to other impacts. Existential risk compared to other impacts. There are 2 helpful explanations that I think will explain the case for why existential risk is its own category. First is Parfit's explanation. This guy named Parfit is quoted by everyone who writes about existential risk. And so this is kind of the default explanation for existential risk. Some of you have already heard this before, others of you have not. But it is the intro to why existential risk is different. I believe that if we destroy mankind as we now can, this outcome will be much worse than most people think. Compare 3 outcomes. First, peace. Second, a nuclear war that kills 99% of the world's existing population. Third, a nuclear war that kills 100%. 2 would be worse than 1, and 3 would be worse than 2. Which is the greater of these 2 differences? Think about that for a sec. Peace, a nuclear war that kills 99% of the world's existing population, a nuclear war that kills 100%. Obviously, 2's worse than 1. Obviously 3's worse than 2. The question is, which is the greater difference? Parfit says this: most people believe that the greater difference is between 1 and 2. I believe that the difference between 2 and 3 is very much greater. The Earth will remain habitable for at least another billion years. Civilization began only a few thousand years ago. If we do not destroy mankind, these few thousand years may be only a tiny fraction of the whole of civilized human history. The difference between 2 and 3 may thus be the difference between this tiny fraction and all of the rest of history. If we compare this possible history to a day, what has occurred so far is only a fraction of a second. Whoa. Second explanation is from Bostrom. And this is where he does the math. To calculate the loss associated with an existential catastrophe, remember that is an existential risk happening, we must consider how much value would come to exist in its absence. It turns out that the ultimate potential for Earth-originating intelligent life is literally astronomical. Yes, he does say literally. Because he means literally. It is astronomical. If we suppose with Parfit, who we just quoted, that our planet will remain habitable for at least another billion years, and we assume that at least 1 billion people could live on it sustainably, then the potential exists for at least 10 to the 18th human lives. Let that soak in for a second. 10 to the 18th. However, the relevant figure is not how many people could live on Earth, but how many descendants we could have in total. One lower bound of the number of biological human life years in the future accessible universe is 10 to the 34th years. Even if we use the most conservative estimate, we find that the expected loss of an existential catastrophe is greater than the value of 10 to the 18th human lives. Here's where the math happens, and your mind gets blown. This implies that the expected value of reducing existential risk by a mere 1/1,000,000th of 1 percentage point is at least 10 times the value of a billion human lives. I'll read it again. This implies that the expected value of reducing existential risk by a mere 1/1,000,000th of 1 percentage point is at least 10 times the value of a billion human lives. But wait, there's more. The expected value of reducing existential risk by a mere 1/1,000,000th of 1/1,000,000th of 1 percentage point is worth 100 billion times as much as a billion human lives. One might consequently argue that even the tiniest reduction of existential risk has an expected value greater than that of the definite provision of any ordinary good, such as the direct benefit of saving 1 billion lives. So he has made the argument for you. Mind's blown?
Yeah.
Roman numeral 2. Going for existential risk impacts. David Watson is here. Hello, David. Roman numeral 2. Got a little distracted there. David Watson is a pretty good-looking dude. Going for existential risk impacts. Going for existential risk impacts. 3 subpoints. Subpoint A is control the framing. Control the framing. First, front load. If this is what's going to be your thing, if this is what you're going for, it needs to start in the 1AC. You should have a defense of why the reduction of existential risk is the most important thing in your 1AC if you expect to go for existential risk trumps non-existential risk in your 2AR. Second, you should use the cross-X to bolster your position. Clarify and contest their internal links to extinction, which we'll talk about below. Preview their responses to your impact comparison. And get them to commit to a particular impact frame that you can then debate and defeat in your speeches. So it's very likely that you'll read evidence in your 1AC that establishes that existential risk is most important. The negative will say something in the 1 and C. You need to cross-X about those responses if you're going to go for existential risk outweighs. Number 3, contest the negative's access to existential risks. You cannot let them also access an existential risk. Or if they do, you need to explain why the plan reduces existential risk more than it increases it. You need to read evidence, and we'll talk more about this in the answering existential risk impact section. You need to read evidence which contests whether the thing they have identified is an existential risk. You need to contest the internal links that they have described to that existential risk. But at the end of the debate, you can't let them control the direction of existential risk. Fourth and finally, under the A subpoint, insulate the impact from turns the case. Insulate the impact from turns the case. One of the best ways that the negative can answer existential risk arguments is by making the claim that the disadvantage happens in a shorter term and that it therefore turns the ability of the AF to reduce existential risk. You can't let that happen. And knowing that, you must take that argument seriously from the beginning. Even if they don't make a clear turns the case argument, you need to, in the 1AR, be answering every possible version of turns the case so that you are decidedly ahead on that regardless of what the 2NR says. I guess as a side note to that, and maybe a fifth, so number 5, know what is important. When you are going for an existential risk first kind of framing, you don't have to win as much as you normally do. Because you have evidence that supports your impact comparison, you have established the framework for what counts as the most important impact. You have to beat, we have an existential risk too, and you have to beat our DA turns your case. If you defeat those arguments, you are almost certain to win unless the negative uses some of the advice below about debating and answering existential risk impacts. But these are the things that you will lose on if this is the style of affirmative that you want to read. Subpoint B. I guess we kind of already talked about this, but it's still good. It deserves its own subpoint. Read evidence to support the importance of existential risk. First, we have a file that we did at Georgetown with Donnie and Sankalp that is an existential risk core. That's kind of the beginning of a beginning set of materials that you can use to debate existential risk arguments. It includes basically everything that's been written about existential risk, which we'll talk about below, actually in number 2, so momentarily. Nick Bostrom, Matheny, Leslie, there are very few authors which write about existential risk. We've kind of got cards from all of them, and that set of materials is clearly the best existential risk file that has ever been written because it might be the first one that has ever been written. Second, take advantage of the research bias. Take advantage of the research bias. This is what I just previewed. Most of the authors that write about existential risk in a scholarly way, so I'm not talking about journalists who use the term extinction, I'm talking about academics who have scholarly work about existential risk, say it's really important and that it's something that needs to be added to priority considerations in policymaking circles. There's a book called Global Catastrophic Risks that's edited by Sirkovic, and who's another author, and Bostrom. And it's basically, I don't know how many pages it is. It's a lot of pages, 800 pages maybe, about why existential risks are being underappreciated, underaddressed, ignored, not discussed in the public sphere, not taken seriously by politicians, and they take issue with that. I have yet to find an 800-page book that says we shouldn't take existential risk seriously. Maybe it exists, but just by the nature of this literature, it's specialized literature, it's a very small academic community, and the only people that would be interested in existential risk are those who believe in existential risk. You can take advantage of that inherent research bias to defeat negative teams that just don't have access to the same quality of materials. You can essentially think about this like existential risk important is like the K that there are no book reviews of. There's some stuff, and we'll talk about it below, but you should be at a very strong advantage. If Bostrom was debating on this topic, he would win a lot of debates. Number 3 is read comparative evidence, and I kind of previewed this already. Evidence that compares different risks, extinction risks, to one another. Bostrom does this all the time. Cirkovic does this. Leslie does this. Matheny does this to an extent. There's a lot of evidence that says, given the realm of the many existential risks that face humanity, here's one that needs to be taken very seriously. Or this one is more serious than this one. Or this subsection of Bostrom's sort of typography of existential risk is more urgent than this other one. So for example, Bostrom thinks, as should have been evident from the listing, that human or anthropogenic catastrophes are more likely than natural ones. He thinks it's more likely that we're all going to die because of something we did than because of something in nature. So he thinks intentional misuse of nanotechnology, unintentional misuse of nanotechnology, genetically engineered bioweapons, all of those kind of things that we could do to ourselves are more likely to cause extinction than something that nature would just do in the absence of people. But you should read comparative evidence. And that's another place where you can take advantage of kind of the asymmetric nature of the literature about existential risk. Subpoint C is to capitalize on the persuasiveness of try or die. Capitalize on the persuasiveness of try or die. First, this is an accepted filter. One of the issues with doing kind of innovative things in risk assessment is that it requires that judges assess debates differently than they usually do. In the case of existential risk first, you don't have that problem because try or die is a framing that is ubiquitous in debate. You can capitalize on its general acceptance, bolster the argument. Even judges that don't like the try or die framing have heard it enough that they know what you mean. And you can boost the credibility of the argument they kind of already understand by reading evidence, by spicing it up, by making it better. And that's number 2. Spice up the script. Whenever possible, it helps to get away from the same old phrasings that judges have heard a million times when someone has extended the skifta politics dissad. What you are talking about when you are affirmative and discussing existential risk is really a threat to humankind. And you're citing evidence from authors who have really thought about this and decided this really is a threat to Earth-originating intelligent life. And they've done the math, they've done the impact calc. All of these cards are very good because they're comparative. Spice it up. If you debate this just like everyone else debates it, you can still have some success, but this is an opportunity to take an accepted or ubiquitous filter or lens and spice it up and win a bunch of debates with it. It's much easier than creating one of your own. Number 3, make it about risk reduction. A lot of the negative tricks or negative tactics in response to existential risk arguments is that the plan doesn't eliminate all existential risk. Extinction is inevitable for other reasons. Our dissent has some access to extinction. You need to frame your argument better than that. And this is a pragmatic or practical example of spicing up the script. Bostrom's argument or Matheny's argument or whoever else that you will read evidence from that makes the existential risk first argument, their claim is not that we must reduce existential risk to 0. They know that that's not true. Bostrom, for example, thinks that the risk of human extinction in the next 100 years is greater than 20%. Okay, that's not good. Okay, that's sad. But his argument is not that therefore we have to reduce it to 0 or our project is worthless. That card that we read above says that every incremental reduction in existential risk is so much more valuable than anything we could possibly do on Earth that it must be our priority. You need to preempt the explanation of your argument that the negative will want to make, which is that you have to solve existential risk. Risk is not something that can be solved. It's not something that can be avoided. There is an existential risk, always, regardless of what your plan does. Unless your plan causes extinction, then we're extinct, so there's no more risk. But in the absence of that, there is some existential risk. Your argument is that your plan reduces the risk of extinction, and that there is incredible value in that reduction. That is a different argument than we solve extinction. If it's about solving extinction, hard for AF to win. If it's about reducing existential risk, hard for neg to win. Fourth, prepare blocks to common rejoinders. The phrase that people started rocking at Georgetown was die or die. You've got to crush that argument at the top of your 2AR with something just as clever. I don't know what that is. We can certainly work on it or talk about it. But you need to anticipate what their tricks are, what their phrasings are, and you need to address them head on. If this is what you want to go for, if you want to read an existential risk AF, you need to be prepared more for the framing and the impact comparison debate than you do the mechanics of the rest of it. Because you can win a ton of debates, even if they win their whole dysad, or 2 dysads, or 4 dysads, or 12 dysads, as long as you control relative existential risk. And if you have qualified evidence from people who actually study existential risk that say that your plan reduces that risk, and they have some cards from the Nikkei Weekly that happen to have the word human survival in them, I hope to God you win. Roman numeral 3. Take off the AF hat. Take a drink of water. I'm going to put on the neg hat. Okay. Answering existential risk impacts. So hopefully that last however many minutes this has been convinced you that existential risk arguments are awesome. I think they are awesome to an extent. They're interesting. They're supported by very strong scholarship. This is a lot different than the race to extinction impacts using newspaper cards. So I do think they're awesome, but they are not unbeatable. Subpoint A. Deny that the impact poses an existential risk. Deny that the impact poses an existential risk. First, most impacts are probably not existential risks. They're not, despite what debaters think. Even Bostrom doesn't really think nuclear war is likely to cause extinction. Environmental collapse, probably not likely to cause extinction. Warming, probably not likely to cause extinction. All of these impacts are very much improbable that they cause extinction. If you are debating a team that identifies existential risk as the thing that needs to be addressed, you should push back hard on that's actually not an existential risk. Or that's not a very likely existential risk. Or there are a lot of other existential risks which are equally important. Your plan really doesn't reduce much. So yes, there's a chance that the computer simulation gets turned off, but whatever. It's so unlikely, it's not really an existential risk. Second, some impacts probably are existential risks, but they're very improbable, and often the AF has very little access to them. So to use the example that we've been debating about at Georgetown and here, the asteroids AF. Bostrom says asteroids could cause extinction. Bostrom says it's worthwhile to invest in deflection technology. But at the same time, Bostrom thinks that's pretty low on the list of existential threats. And the negative in these debates has a good argument that the AF doesn't reduce that risk to 0 because they can't detect all of the asteroids. They can't deflect all of the asteroids. So yes, there's a small reduction in existential risk, but it's not very big. Number 3. This is an area where preparation matters a lot. Having a file of evidence that answers X is existential, Y is existential, Z is existential is really, really helpful on this topic. If I was an enterprising affirmative debater, I might get good at debating existential risk and then just pick different weird impacts in every debate. Not every debate, but I would have some new AFs, some new impacts. You need to prepare for these affirmatives like you would prepare for Wipeout or Spark or those other scenarios that kind of have laundry lists of weird technology that they talk about. Having some evidence matters. We've done a little bit of work on this in that existential risk file. This is an area where we can do some more work and kind of put together a set of materials that you could take home with you that discusses what is and what is not an existential risk. So subpoint A was deny that the impact poses an existential risk. That's obviously the most obvious one. Obvi. Subpoint B, undermine the try or die framing. Undermine the try or die framing. I think there are 3 ways to do this. First, introduce a counterplan that prevents extinction. Introduce a counterplan that prevents extinction. At Georgetown, I released the refuge counterplan, which before that had been undisclosed to the world. I think we may have read it a couple times at Marquette. It establishes a extinction refuge on Earth and says that if we do that, there will be no extinction. Some people will live. The reason that is so powerful is because it takes out that Bostrom article or argument that we just talked about. Bostrom says as long as humanity survives, the difference between 99.9% dying and 100% isn't a big deal. He's like NBD. Humanity will survive. The other idea that has not yet been written is to read a counterplan that researches existential risk. Bostrom says in one of his articles that this is the best way to reduce existential risk. It's sort of a self-serving thing because a lot of these people want to be taken more seriously. So one of their recommendations is always, others should take us more seriously. So perhaps we can work on that counterplan. I think I only have 1 card at this point, but we can investigate that counterplan as a way to reduce existential risk without sending anything into space. I can't tell you how powerful these counterplans are. If that counterplan is in the 2NR and you have a dissad that it does not link to, the try or die framing is almost entirely stopped. They have to win then that the extinction refuge doesn't work. And I have not seen any cards about that. Because the only people that write about this are Bostrom and his cronies. Second, establish the baseline for existential risk. I talked about these arguments above when we were talking about how the affirmative can answer them. But you can say that extinction is inevitable regardless of the plan. This is something that the affirmative typically will not make arguments about or read evidence about. Even if it's true that humanity kind of lives out its natural lifespan, the sun will eventually implode, it will die out, and humanity will go extinct. Or, alternatively, what a lot of these extinction risk authors talk about is humanity will just evolve beyond humanity. It might not seem like an important thing, but it does kind of address a central thesis of the affirmative, which is that it's really important to keep humanity around forever. If it's true that humanity is not forever, not like a diamond, then maybe it doesn't matter as much how long humanity lasts. It can kind of diffuse some of the rhetorically powerful affirmative evidence that speaks to the importance of maintaining possibility. We are all going to die at some point. There are authors who disagree with that, and that's the affirmative rejoinder. But this is a powerful negative argument. Also, make the argument that the plan might reduce existential risk, but it doesn't eliminate it, and the inherent shortcomings in our forecasting or predictions mean that there's also a chance that the plan unintentionally increases the risk of extinction. Bostrom has an awesome answer to the predictions K, which is rhetorically powerful, but in reality doesn't really contest this argument very much. He says that even if all of that is true, we have to do the best we can, and he says so in a very passionate, strong way, which makes it a great card. But at the same time, this argument is just kind of true. These predictions or forecasts are so long-term, we have so little hard data to support these predictions, that it is just as likely, or at least it is somewhat likely, that things that we think reduce existential risk might actually increase it. This argument appeals to the inherent shortcomings in human knowledge at this current point in time. Because in order for the affirmative to win their argument, they need to win that they have correctly identified a plan that reduces existential risk. Maybe we just shouldn't believe them. Third, act access an existential risk? Again, pretty obvious. You can access the same existential risk and then compare internal link arguments, or you can access a different existential risk as kind of a defensive argument. So a lot of you have just kind of fallen into this when you've debated the asteroids affirmative. You've said that your DA is an extinction risk as a way to diffuse the extinction first framework. And then you have made arguments about why, if both are existential threats, we should just consider probability and time frame. In the next, the first half of this lecture, which will be given at a future time, we'll talk about ways to kind of spice that up and make it better. But that is an effective argument. As much as I think that argument kind of oversimplifies the debate, it is clearly an effective argument. A lot of practice debates have been won on that argument. Subpoint C, last subpoint. Criticize the extinction first framework. Criticize the extinction first framework. So up until this point, we've been playing D. We've been pushing back. We've been trying to hold the line. Now let's go on the offense. Ryan Braun has stepped into the batter's box. First, trade-off DA. Focusing on existential risk trades off with efforts to address more immediate harms. There are good cards about this from Linda Williams, and this is something that we're going to continue to develop. Those cards are in the Georgetown extinction file. I think we should do more research about this, but the argument is specific to space, and it's sort of the opposite of it is the argument that the critique answers that we were talking about last night respond to, which is the claim that we've got to fix the Earth first. There are problems on Earth. They are a big deal for the people living on Earth, and we've got to deal with them. And focusing on existential risk, focusing on getting off the rock, those are distractions from the things that matter most, which is the problems in the world. So trade-off DA. 2, policy paralysis DA. This takes that predictions unreliable argument, injects it with some Balco-approved steroids, and makes it offense. Existential risk assessment might be so unreliable that it results in an inability to make decisions. If our foremost consideration is existential risk, it is hard to figure out what to do. If every one of our policy decisions has the possibility of killing 10 to the 18th billion people, that's a lot of responsibility, and that is tough. I don't want to have responsibility for that kind of decision. And when there are viable reasons that any course of action could increase or decrease existential risk, I don't know what we do. Third, future fetish DA. Future fetish. One of the assumptions of the extinction first folks is that people in the future are just as valuable as people today. Maybe, or maybe not. Because those people don't exist. Maybe currently alive people are more important than future people because currently alive people actually exist. Maybe when we focus on future generations, we sanction horrible things to people who are actually alive in the name of protecting some future set of people that do not yet exist. There is a debate about this in the ethics literature. There are good arguments on both sides. I don't know how I feel about this, but I do know that the arguments are good enough on both sides that this is a good debate argument. So trade-off DA, policy paralysis DA, future fetish DA. Drink of water. Number 4, risk aversion DA. Risk aversion DA. This is a little bit different version of the predictions not so good argument. One of the presuppositions of the extinction first authors is that we need to be very risk averse. They take very low probabilities very seriously. They imagine the worst case outcome and they take it as if it's a given. And they have reasons that makes sense. They defend that.
Thank you.
But the argument can also be made, citing other authors, that model of decision-making is terrible because risk-averse decision-making results in serial policy failure. It results in overestimating improbable outcomes. It makes a mockery of causation and just kind of rational argument. Right? You no longer have to prove that anything is likely. You just have to say that it's possible. So the replacement of probable with possible is bad. I think you can develop a persuasive DA or K of the way the affirmative thinks about risk from that literature. Number 5, last one. The disaster planning DA. Disaster planning DA. Infatuation with existential risk deters people from planning for post-disaster recovery. If we're convinced that we're all going to die if something happens, we don't take preparations to figure out what to do when that thing happens. This is an argument from a long time ago where people would read evidence from this guy, Brian Martin, who I think was brought up last night from Wollongong University in Australia, who made this argument in the context of nuclear war. It was a critique of the idea that nuclear war causes extinction. He disagrees with that claim, but more than that, he says that when we say that nuclear war causes extinction, it means that we discourage or deter people from figuring out what to do if a nuclear war happens. How do we rebuild? The reason this argument is powerful is because it's consistent with the pro-extinction first people's infatuation with survival. Right? Maybe the way the affirmative frames extinction makes it more likely that something that otherwise wouldn't cause extinction will, because we won't know what to do when it happens. I have not found any evidence, I haven't spent very much time researching this argument in the context of asteroids, but the argument would go like this. Saying that asteroids cause extinction, that rhetoric, that discourse, means that if an asteroid does strike, we will not have post-asteroid plans. Which means that if the asteroid does not cause extinction, which our evidence says is more likely than it does cause extinction, we're screwed. We have no idea what to do. We can't rebuild. Which means that the asteroid impact that otherwise would not have caused extinction has now caused extinction because of the way that you have hyped the impact. That's called a turn. Or a turnaround. So trade-off DA, policy paralysis DA, future fetish DA, risk aversion DA, disaster planning DA. Catchy names. We've got some evidence for some of them. I think we should spend some of the next 2 weeks cutting evidence for others. But that is how you debate existential risk.